Diablo 4 Campfire Chat. I am Adam Fletcher. I'm the community lead here for the Diablo franchise, and I'm joined by two people here. One of them, familiar face, one of them, a new face.
Yeah.
Feel free to introduce yourself, you guys.
Hi, everyone. I'm Charles Dunn. I'm an associate game designer working on the live balance team.
And hey, everybody, I'm Adam Jackson. I'm the lead class designer for Diablo 4.
And as you guys know, like last week, we talked a lot about Season 2. We actually revealed kind of like all the details about Season 2. We went into a bunch of different updates that are going to be coming with Season 2. And then this stream was specifically for class updates, talking about resistances, talking about updates to damage buckets, and more. We actually have a lot to talk about. Hopefully, hopefully you guys like numbers, because I brought some designers. Hopefully you guys like to hear about all these changes that we're going to be going through. But at the same time, we're also going to be talking about some future updates that are coming for the game as well.
Yep.
We will talk about the first update that's going to be hitting after Season 2 launches, which is patch 121. So we'll be hitting on that at the end of the actual stream. But before we kind of like jump into 121, I know that you guys have a lot to talk about regarding classes, resistances, damage buckets, unique items. Take it away, Adam.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, we can start jumping to slides. So the class team and really the whole Diablo 4 team has been very busy with improving the game. So our strategy for the Season of Blood is kind of a 5-point strategy. The high-level goal here was we were focusing on addressing player feedback and really making systemic improvements to the game. We wanted to improve the whole foundation of the game from the ground up as much as we could. So our strategy for the Season of Blood, firstly, we wanted to update elemental resistances. We've heard feedback that they weren't quite hitting the mark that we wanted to, and so we're making some changes there. We're also looking to make uniques more exciting and impactful. We're also going through every class systemically and looking at improvements to address commonly talked about issues that we've kind of heard from the community and from playing the game ourselves. We're also updating damage buckets and the underlying math of how the game works to make it a little more even and have better parity between builds and classes. And then the final one is really making all of these changes a bonus and making it feel like this is a large improvement to the game from the ground up. So I think we'll take it over with Charles first to talk about elemental resistances.
Yeah, let's talk about resistances. So currently in the Season of the Malignant on live right now, resistances are calculated in a way called inverse multiplicative. So what this means is that if you have, say, 20% poison resistance, and then you grab another piece of gear that has 20% more, your character stat sheet will actually show that you have 36% poison resistance. And that's because there's a diminishing returns. On the more resistance you get, it will never quite get you up to 100%. It's always kind of like 20% of the, the remaining amount. So it doesn't quite get you up to 100%. And this means that you can stack resistances essentially infinitely. There's no hard cap. You could get resistance on every piece of gear, and it would contribute to reducing that damage that you're taking. Additionally, right now, armor contributes both to elemental damage reduction. It kind of gets factored into this calculation, and it also reduces the physical damage you've taken from just enemies' regular attacks instead of the elemental attacks. So going forward into the Season of Blood, resistances are going to change how they're calculated, and they're now going to be additive. So that means if you have the 20% poison resistance and you grab another piece that has 20% more, you're going to have 40% resistance on your character stat sheet exactly as you would expect. Although since this adds up additively now, we do need to add a cap. So the resistances are going to be capped at a baseline of 70%. So your character can stack as up to 70% resistance. There are some effects in the game that allow you to go up to 85% with various effects that increase your max resistance, but those are rather rare because they are quite powerful. Additionally, armor is also going to only affect physical damage. As it used to do both, it's now only going to be calculated when you're taking physical damage and not when you're taking elemental damage. Additionally, to kind of make everyone have a baseline level of resistances, we're going to be updating rings so that they have all resistance at all times. Amulets already have all resistance, but rings used to have two separate elemental resistance. They could have, say, fire resistance plus cold resistance. Now they'll have all resistance along with one random one, such as fire resistance. And in order to really make sure that your character can survive a lot of these elemental damage that the monsters are going to be throwing out at you, you definitely want to be able to stack a lot of this resistance. But there's a lot of options to get it. You can get it through gear affixes, through Paragon points, skill tree nodes, as well as consumables and variety of other sources. So let's talk a little bit about the overall impact that you're going to see as a player. First and most importantly, resistances are going to matter a lot more in Season of Blood. They are just going to be a very important part of building your character. You're definitely going to want to look to try to cap up at that 70% mark as you're getting into the late game and fighting the most dangerous monsters. They're also going to be a little bit more complex. There's a little bit of a puzzle to solve here with hitting that cap. You're going to want to get, resistance. Yeah, resistance stonks for sure.
You're going to care about them.
You're definitely going to want to be caring about resistances as you're building your character in Season of Blood. Let's talk a little bit about our overall goals for the elemental resistance system. And I think it's important to talk about goals when we're talking about these really big systemic changes, because as we're going through and tuning a lot of the numbers and the balance of everything that's coming in Season of Blood, I mean, there's a lot in Season of Blood, obviously, we are going to be looking at the tuning and balance of these systems through the lens of these goals. So if it turns out that some of our exact tuning, maybe isn't hitting these goals, then we're going to be reevaluating them. And that's why we really want to share our goals for these systems with you. So the first one is that we want this system to have an endpoint. Players should be able to hit that 70% cap at roughly level 80 for most resistances. This isn't going to be something that you're chasing up to level 100 and you need absolute best possible gear in order to hit this cap. It's going to be something that's very achievable for most players as they're getting into that late game around level 80-ish. Our second goal is that all players, even if they're not paying too close attention to this, shouldn't fall too far behind. That's why we're adding the all resist to rings and amulets. This is a failsafe to ensure that players will always have some baseline minimum amount of resistance, so they're not getting completely destroyed by elemental damage if they're not really optimizing this. And finally, this is going to be a puzzle to solve for players as you're building your character, and there's a lot of paths to solve it. This isn't a situation where you need the absolute best possible gear to solve this. It's that we give you a lot of different options. You can get affixes of resistance through Paragon, elixirs, gems in particular is very important. And it's all about optimizing your character to find the best way for you to reach the resistance cap rather than can you reach it at all. I really want to highlight this elixir here. We've updated all of the elemental resist elixirs so that they also include, you can see here, a maximum poison resistance increased by 6%. And that's really impactful, especially because the resistance that you get kind of in excess of 70% is disproportionately valuable. Just to give you an example, let's say you're going from 0% resistance up to 5% resistance. What that means is, well, you're taking 5% less damage. You would have taken 100 damage, now you take 95. But if you're already at, say, 70% resistance at the cap, and you go up to 76% resistance, what that means is if you were to take 100 poison damage, well, at 70%, you would have taken actually 30. But now at 76, you're only taking 24 because you have 76% resistance. And that's actually a 20% damage reduction. You're gaining a lot more effective life whenever you add that extra cap at the end. So really getting to that cap and pushing above the cap is a great way to give you a better fighting chance against some of these late game bosses who all have these elemental effects. And yeah, these elixirs are going to be a key part of your arsenal to take on those late game bosses. All right, I think we want to move on.
Go on to the next
to the to uniques.
Yeah.
Yes, Adam, take it away.
Yeah, so firstly, talking a little bit about those goals really quick. Something that is really important to me and the team is that, when we're talking to you about the updates we're doing to the game, that you understand kind of why we're making these changes and what our goals are, because, you're going to see as we go through all of these, we're changing like a lot of how the underlying math and other systems of the game work. And, the odds are high that we don't nail everything perfectly. But if you understand what we're trying to do, and we're more transparent about that, then when you're having discussions with each other, when you're giving feedback to us, they can just be a little bit more high level and better sources of information when you also understand why we're doing things. So now moving on to uniques, let's get into it. So generally, we feel, and we've heard the feedback, that they're just not exciting enough. For the end game chase items, they're supposed to be really, really awesome and cool. They're just not hitting the mark all the time. Too often players really don't feel good when they drop, and really what is an alarm bell for me personally is that when there's a unique for your build and it's intended to be good for that build, let's say like a Fireball unique for a Fireball Sorcerer, and then the Fireball Sorcerer doesn't even want that, right? Like, we don't want that situation to happen, whether it's because the unique effect isn't good enough or the stats on the gear aren't good enough. We want to make sure these are exciting and awesome and attractive to get. So we did a giant pass, and we updated nearly every single unique in the game. Not all of them, but pretty close. So we have a fourfold strategy, and I'm going to go through here using some fake examples of kind of what we did, and then we're going to go through some real examples of actual changes that we made to the game. So the first one, and by the way, we're also not just doing this in Season of Blood, but this is kind of how we're going to be looking at making uniques unique going forward. So the first one is adding new stats to them. So as an example here, increased tornado duration isn't really a stat that exists in the game that can be on gear, but it could potentially exist on a unique. The next one is giving larger existing stat ranges. So as an example here, bonus fire damage would normally roll between, let's say, 15 and 25%. I just made these numbers up. But, on a unique, it could be between 30 and 45%, or some even higher number, right? Like, we can mess with those ranges and make them more attractive. The next one is overriding slot rules. So the example here, weapons normally can't roll cooldown reduction, which is a really powerful stat on an item, but on a unique, it potentially could. And then the last one is updating unique effects. This is really like actually updating the special thing that the unique does that adds to your player power. So the example here, a unique could normally require hitting enemies from behind on Tuesdays, but now it'll just work when you hit enemies, right? We just make it easier and more consistent.
I love damage on Tuesdays. It's my favorite affix.
Me too. Tuesday's a good day.
Yeah.
All right, so now let's go through some actual changes. So the first one is Fists of Fate. This is our favorite random item where everything's just lucky hit and chance-based. One of the issues with this unique is that, because a lot of your stats on your gloves are damage related, and this one doesn't really give you that direct just damage power, we're taking one of the lucky hit effects and changing it to a new stat that doesn't exist anywhere else in the game. That's basically a chance to give you a damage buff for a certain amount of time. So now this will make up for some of that, not giving you your, skill rank stats or other things, but now it gives you some damage. Next one, we've got the Grasp of Shadow. This is a rogue unique that's themed around summoning shadow clones to do damage. You can see on the left, that's the old version. The shadow clone damage range was between 14 to 21%, and now it can roll between 31 and 52%, so it's much higher. Next one, we've got Hellhammer. We've actually got a couple of things going on here. You can see here, first one is, again, increasing the stat ranges. The damage to burning enemies goes from 14 to, 28%. And now it's going to 42 to 70%. So a lot more damage to burning enemies. And then the next one is actually overriding the slot rule and adding a new stat that can't normally be on weapons, which is ranks to upheaval. And when we start going later in the presentation, you're going to learn that skill ranks are really, really powerful in the Season of Blood and going forward. So this is going to make this item much more attractive than it used to be. And then the last one, updating unique effects. This is another Barbarian unique, Ancient's Oath. So before, it was that Steel Grasp launched 2 additional chains, which it's still doing and is pretty neat. And before, it was that it slowed enemies that got hit. And, we found really that adding a slowed enemies isn't really quite the powerful effect that we want. So instead of doing a slow, now it's going to give you a whole bunch of multiplicative bonus damage to anything that you grab. So again, just straight up a lot more powerful than it was before. All right, now we're also going to be adding some new legendaries and uniques to Season 2. So here we're going to go through some of the uniques specifically that we're adding that you can be chasing when you're going through Diablo 4. So this first one is called Flicker Step. This one is basically when you evade through enemies, you're going to reduce your ultimate cooldown by a pretty chunky amount. So you can see here, as the player is evading through enemies, their ultimate cooldown is getting a lot shorter. So you can, try and create an ultimate build where you're just focused on using your ultimate a bunch of times. The next one is Scoundrel's Leathers. This is a new rogue unique. This one says that when you have Inner Sight active and you have that unlimited energy, then on cast, when you cast a core skill, you have a chance to spawn a random trap. And this random trap can also be death trapped, so it's pretty cool. And last but not least, this is one of my favorite ones, is Dolmen Stone. This is for the Druid. And it says that when you cast Hurricane and then you cast Boulder while your Hurricane is active, your Boulder will actually spin around you and get caught in the Hurricane. And yes, you can actually have multiple boulders going on at once. It's pretty awesome. All right, next we're going to be talking about class improvements. So this is the next part of our strategy, which is really looking at the issues that the community's been talking about with every class and
before you actually jump in, because I know a lot of people are seeing the item levels on some of those uniques.
Oh yeah.
And stuff. And I know last week we had talked about item level being 920. But then there's some of the uniques that we showed earlier, for instance, actually ended up showcasing like 925 or other numbers beyond. So,
yeah, I wanted to be clear.
Yeah.
Yeah, 925 is going to be the new maximum range that you can get for your gear. So 925 is the max eye power you can get to.
Yeah, so it's
double check.
it's us clarifying essentially last week where we said 920, but it's actually 925.
Yeah.
So we just wanted to clear that up with everyone to make sure that people understood.
Yep. All right, so next let's talk about the uniques that you can get in the game. So as you know, we can go to the next slide. Oh, it's good?
Okay.
Oh, I don't, oh, there we go.
we go.
Okay, cool.
Sweet.
Yeah, so here we're just going to give you a preview here so you can now target farm uniques. And to be clear here, with these new bosses that we're adding in the Season of Blood, these are the uniques that the boss will be able to drop. Now, you can still get uniques from all content in the game. It's just a rare chance to get any of them, but you have a much higher chance to get these specific uniques off of these specific bosses. So here you can see a list. That was the first one. Next is Varshan here. So if you're chasing any of these, you know you want your Staff of Endless Rage or your Mad Wolf's Glee as a druid. This is who you're going to be target farming. Next we've got Lord Zir. So here's the list. We can stay here for a few seconds and just
we'll post these lists on the site so that players can actually reference back to these if they need to after the stream. But these are all the. I know we've gotten a lot of questions about like, hey, you talked about target farming. Like, what can I actually target farm off of these new bosses? And so we wanted to make sure that we actually showcase that list here, so every player can actually see all the uniques that they can actually target farm specifically from these bosses.
Yep, so this is the Beast in Ice. These are all the uniques you can get there. And then last one is Duriel. So here's all the uniques. And a lot of the uniques here, by the way, on Duriel are going to be new ones coming in for the season. So he's got a lot of pretty powerful ones. And then there, last but not least, are the Uber uniques that have a higher chance to drop from him. So this is his loot table.
Get yourself a Shaco.
Yeah, Uber uniques will definitely be more achievable in this season. They'll still be very rare, but if you're getting Duriel on farm and you're killing them a bunch, you're probably going to be able to see one of them throughout a season.
Most definitely we'll be able to see one if you're really farming on Duriel, and at the same time, you'll probably know a lot of people within your own clan that actually will end up having Uber uniques this season. And again, these bosses are available in Season 2, but they're also available in the Eternal Realm on day 1 with October 17th. So.
All right, so now let's get to the class improvements. So yeah, our strategy here was addressing issues with each class that the community is talking about. These changes are mostly unique to each class, and they're meant to target specific pain points that players have been having. What you'll be seeing here today, by the way, in this presentation are just some examples. It's not a list of all the changes. If we did that, we'd be here all day. But we will be coming out with patch notes and a blog explaining things pretty soon right after this stream. We're going to give you a preview kind of what you can expect. So the first one is a general change, and this is that fortify amounts, when you gain fortify, are going to be changed from being based on your base life to your maximum life. And what this means is that increasing your maximum life is going to make these effects stronger, and this is across the board.
Yeah, I think this is a really important change for any kind of build that's trying to build really tanky. They want to build fortify, they want to build max life, and previously, whenever fortify was based on your base life, building more maximum life actually meant that it was harder to get your character fully fortified. Well, because you had more life to fortify through. And so with this change, you can see here in this example on the left, pretty much the same character, almost the exact same life total. Before, you would get about 368 fortify with this effect. And now the exact same effect, exact same character, now gets 677. So almost double amount. If you are building a lot of maximum life like this character is, you're just going to see a lot more fortify values, which means it's a lot easier for your character to get into that powerful fortified state.
All right, next we're going to talk about some class adjustments here. So during our Season of the Malignant live stream, if you remember, we talked about how sometimes we're going to need to make adjustments to things that are overperforming. right? So I want you to imagine for a little bit that you have your perfect game that you're creating, right? Where your power level of everything in the game is here, balance-wise, right? Everything's exactly the same. Firstly, we live in the real world, so no game's really exactly like this. It's more like something like this, right? Where you have a range where, your lowest power thing and your highest power thing are within here. And this is actually better for a healthier game, because if everything's exactly the same, then, your power level can get kind of flat and boring, right? If like Fireball does the exact same as Upheaval, does the exact same as everything else, your game can end up kind of flat. So some variance is pretty good, right? But then sometimes, when things get out of this range, that's kind of a sweet spot. If something is like way up here, then this can warp the design and warp what players are doing and warp even the perception in front of the game. So one of the things that we had talked about during that stream is when we have things that are up here, usually this is due to either like unplanned synergies, or something that's bugged or working unintended. It can get out of the range. And so we're committed now that when things get out of range too far, we're going to bring it back to that normal realm where everything is. So in the Season of Blood, we're really looking at 3 situations here where this happens. Sometimes builds and playstyles can just dramatically be outperforming others. Another one is fixing unintended interactions that result in extreme outliers. These are usually like bugs or other things like that. And then designs, and this is kind of future-proofing, but we're looking at designs that have the potential for infinite power scaling. So that going forward, particularly when we're adding leaderboards into the game, we really want to make sure that the power levels of things isn't too out of whack, and particularly for too long of a time. So we're going to be more committed to looking at these things more often. So in the Season of Blood, we don't really have too many of these, and to be clear, the overwhelming majority of our changes are going to be buffs. But these are some adjustments to get ahead of first to make sure that those power levels are kind of the same. We can go to the next slide here. So the first one is Necromancer. If you've played a Bone Spear Necro, you probably saw this coming a little bit. But Ossified Essence, your key passive, we're reducing your damage bonus from 1 to 0.5%. And to be clear here, even after this change, this key passive is still probably a contender for being the strongest one in the game. It's really, really powerful. It adds a ton of damage. And really what this lets us do actually, and you'll see when you get to look at our patch notes, it gives us some room to add power in other places in Bone Necro, rather than it all being centralized only around the key passive. We're also reducing the Bone Graft Legendary Paragon node max essence per stack a little bit. You're still going to be able to get a ton of maximum essence in the game, but we're just bringing these down a little bit. And then the next 2, these are going to be kind of themed. We've got the Barbarian, the Supreme Wrath of the Berserker. This is the one where while your Wrath of the Berserker is active, when you spend Fury, you get a damage bonus on Berserking multiplicatively, and this could scale infinitely, and now we're just adding a cap to it. And then the next one, similarly for the Druid, the aspect of the Rampaging Werebeast, the crit strike damage bonus is now going to be capped at 200%. And again, these numbers are still really high at 100 and 200% multiplicative bonus damage. We're not really looking to just nerf these things to the ground or anything. We're just making sure that there's a cap on the maximum amount you can get, so that in the future when players, it lets us add things like increasing the duration of these or making an infinite duration or doing other things like that that we wouldn't be able to do if these were just uncapped forever. All right, so now let's get to specific classes and kind of the cool things that are coming. So first thing that we've heard from Barbarian players is that their Paragon boards are just kind of weak, right? They're not particularly impactful or exciting. We're going to look here at one example, and we've changed quite a few of these. This is the Decimator Paragon node. Beforehand, we kind of turned into a meme. It gave you a low chance to apply vulnerable to enemies when using a specific weapon, two-handed slashing weapons. And now you can see in the Season of Blood, instead, it's still going to be themed a little bit around vulnerable. But now when you make enemies vulnerable, you just get a percent damage bonus. And then when you overpower vulnerable enemies, you double that and you get a 20% multiplicative damage bonus. So it's much more powerful than it was before and is on par with other similar effects. Next one now is Berserking. Berserking Barbarians are going to be eating pretty happy this patch. The damage bonus used to be additive. So, when you went to the Berserking state and you got that, damage bonus, it was only additive with your other damage bonuses, and now it's going to be multiplicative. So just being in Berserking in general is going to be much more lucrative for you. And next, the of Ancestral Force Legendary, everyone's favorite game mechanic in the game. Before it was that, when you use Hammer of the Ancients, it nuked out some damage and in a little explosion, and then that damage kind of had a separate value. And so sometimes you'd be motivated to, turn around and attack and not hit the enemy directly because you want to hit him with the explosion and not your normal hit. Now it's just going to cause the quake to happen, but it just increases the damage of the base skill, and then the quake and the base skill just do one source of damage. So now you're not motivated anymore to do any strange behavior. Next one, let's talk about the sorcerer. So Incinerate is getting a pretty big buff here. The ramp up time, so for those of you who don't play, or play Incinerate builds, before it used to be that it ramped up over 4 seconds. So you would, channel your Incinerate on an enemy, and the damage would go up and go up and go up over 4 seconds. And now we're cutting that in half to 2 seconds. The total damage that you're going to get is still the same. We're just making it much easier for you to get that maximum amount, and now you can reposition a lot more often. And next one, Enhanced Frozen Orb. We buffed this so that now it grants additional explosion damage against elites. This includes bosses as well. So normally, Frozen Orb damage is kind of a big AoE damage, so a single target isn't that great. So in boss scenarios, it's not really as good. And now we've added a tuning knob here, so now we can make this much better or more comparable to other builds when it comes to big single target enemies. And then last but not least, we've got some feedback that the Winter and Electrocute Paragon glyphs didn't really have a place where they could be used on the Paragon board. So we've adjusted either the glyphs or the board itself, so now these can be slotted and actually give you a good bonus effect like the other glyphs do.
All right, let's talk about Rogue a little bit. Now, so unlike maybe the Barb and the Sork that we just talked about, we felt that Rogue was honestly in a pretty good place. We didn't have as many pressing issues. There weren't as many things that we really needed to address on Rogue. There were still some things that we saw, but not quite as many as other classes. The one area that we saw was with basic skills. Pretty much every Rogue build was running Puncture. Now, Puncture is a great skill. It does a whole lot of really cool things, but basically the other 4 basic skills were just not seeing really any use at all. And there was a variety of reasons there, and so we have taken a look at the 4 of those to update them, mainly looking at their lucky hit chance for Blade Shift and Forceful Arrow, bringing those up to the 50% chance to kind of keep them on par with the other basics. And then Enhanced Blade Shift, the upgrade to Blade Shift, will now immediately give you the full movement speed bonus. Prior, you had to move through enemies, and it took a little bit of time to ramp up. We're just going to give you that full move speed bonus right off the bat. And then Heartseeker, the critical strike chance that you get whenever Heartseeker hits a target, it previously stacked up at 3% per cast, per stack. And that meant you needed to hit an enemy 5 times before you got the full 15% bonus. And 5 times is a lot. So now we're going to increase the gain per stack up to 5% per stack, so you can get that full bonus within 3 hits, which is very conveniently the same number that you need to max out your combo points. So Heartseeker might see a little bit more play in combo point builds going forward. Additionally, we also took a look at the Impetus passive, and this one we just made it occur a little bit more often. You only need to move 12 instead of 15 meters. But more importantly, it also increases the damage of your next non-basic attack. Prior, it just said your next attack. And that meant that you would occasionally use a basic, and then you'd get the bonus on the basic, which didn't do a lot of damage. Now you're definitely going to be getting this full bonus on a higher damage skill, like a core skill, whenever you get to trigger the Impetus passive. Let's talk about Druid.
Yeah, so similarly to the Rogue, the Druid's in a pretty good place. So not quite as many updates as other classes, but we still found some room to make Druid players happy. First one is Ravens. Ravens is getting pretty good buffs across the board. The passive damage is being increased by 20%. That's the little ravens that peck your enemies to death. The active damage is also getting increased by a whopping 55%, so that's the actual circle of ravens that hit enemies. And then Enhanced Ravens, the bonus critical strike chance that you get is going to be increased from 5 to 8%, so across the board, just a much better skill. And then Rabies. Rabies is also getting a pretty big damage buff. And then we're also making one of the upgrades, which is Natural Rabies. It used to make it that your rabies spread twice as fast, or 100% faster. We're giving half of that baseline. So now your rabies is going to actually just spread between enemies 50% faster, so you don't have to wait as long for them to get infected. And then the Natural Rabies will increase that by another 50% to make it 100.
Yeah, Rabies feels a lot better to play with now. It spreads out to the whole pack right away.
Yeah,
or a lot quicker.
A lot easier to use, yep. And now Necromancer players. So Necromancer players will be pretty happy here. We got a lot of stuff coming for you. And again, this isn't even all of it.
Waiting to reach out after this.
So minions,
Minions are
buffs,
great.
lots of them. First thing is Death's Defense. This is a passive that was kind of mandatory for minion builds. This was really our fail-safe that, a boss or other big hit from enemies wouldn't just one-shot all of your minions. Basically, now that passive is baseline, so now they can't get hit for more than so much of their life without having this defense in there.
I'll also add in that this baseline functionality that your minions can't take more than 30% life, this applies to all player pets across the game, including druids, wolves. That's just how our pets now work. And of course, we've redesigned the Death's Defense passive to give you another alternative if you want even more defense on your minions.
Yeah, good clarification. That druids eating even better today
Yes.
too. Yes.
Yes.
Next, Golem. Basic attack damage is getting doubled. We're insane. But yep, so it's going to get a lot stronger. Your Blood Golem and your Iron Golem's active damage is also going up. The Blood Golem by 55%. The Iron Golem Slam is going to be 15% better. Also, many of your minion Paragon node damage values have been increased. So that scaling minion damage into the mid and late game is also going to be a lot better. Coldbringers aspect. This one used to say that your cold skeletal mages could cast Blizzard. Kind of made sense thematically. Cold mages, Blizzard, cold things. But now we're opening this up to more builds. So now this aspect still makes your mages cast Blizzard, but now you can take any mages that you want, not just cold mages. And next, so we had some affix reductions here. So before we had the Thorns-related affixes, we had one that was specific for your Skeletal Warriors, one for your Skeletal Mages, and another for your Golem. And now we're basically just cleaning that up. So now instead of having 3 separate affixes, we now have one unified, your Minions Inherit Thorns affix, and that can appear on ranged shields and gloves. So now you're going to have a little bit less spam of affixes that you're not interested in if you're not looking for Thorns in your build. And last but not least, shields. This just makes sense. Shields have armor on them. So now when you have a shield as a Necro, it has armor because they protect you. That's what they do.
Yes. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the damage bucket changes. And when I refer to damage buckets, I'm mainly talking about critical strike damage, vulnerable damage, and overpower damage as well. So in Season of the Malignant, vulnerable and critical strike damage were different buckets, and mixing these two, so if you critical struck a vulnerable enemy, would kind of multiply all of your critical strike damage by all of your vulnerable damage, and you just get more than the sum of your parts, like dramatically more. And this meant that the optimal way for basically every single build in the game to play was to stack critical strike damage, was to stack vulnerable damage, and then just make enemies vulnerable, and then crit them. That's how you did most damage in Season of Malignant, no matter what your build, no matter what your class. And so that meant that, say, if an item dropped that had plus crit chance, plus crit damage, and plus vulnerable damage, that was best in slot for literally everyone. And that was unhealthy. It was leading to a lot of stagnation, a lot of builds that could not fully utilize critical strike or vulnerable, say builds like dot builds, because dots can't crit. They couldn't really capitalize on this in the same way, and they got left behind builds that could. So
on the next slide, I think? Or?
Yeah, so moving forward into the Season of Blood, critical strike damage, vulnerable, and overpower as well are going to be different buckets, but mixing them will only give multiplicative damage bonuses capped at a certain amount. So if an enemy is vulnerable, you're going to deal 20% more damage to them. And it doesn't matter how much additional plus vulnerable damage you get, it's not going to increase the 20% multiplicative amount. Same with critical strike, it'll give you 50% multiplicative damage. And then overpower as well. If you overpower an enemy, similar to crit, it'll give you up to 50% bonus damage based on your health total. Overpower calculations are we're not going to get into all the details of exactly how overpower is calculated in Season of the Blood here, but you can definitely check out the patch notes for a more explicit detail there. But basically, know that it has a multiplicative aspect up to 50%, just like crit and vulnerable.
And it'll scale and just be better. Trust us, it'll be good.
Overpower was definitely not overpowered in Season of the Malignant. It was rather on the weak end. And here going into Season of Blood, it is going to be much more powerful. I really expect Blood Necros and Werebear Druids to be doing very well in this season. So let's go over an actual example here with numbers just to clarify what I mean. So if you have 150% critical strike damage, that's what it shows on your character sheet, right? That's how much critical strike damage you have. It also factors in this 50% bonus damage that you deal anytime you crit. And similarly, if you have 200% vulnerable damage, it also factors in that 20% vulnerable damage that is just baseline to vulnerable application. Previously, we would take the entire 150% and multiply it by 200%, and that would be your damage output. It would scale really high. But now we're going to take whatever damage you would deal, and we're going to multiply it by 1.5 because it's a crit, and then we're going to take that result and multiply it by 1.2 because the enemy is vulnerable. And that's why the 50% and the 20% combine to 80. It doesn't combine to 70 because you're multiplying them together. Like I said, so you still get some synergy where it's greater than the sum of its parts, but no longer is it the full 150 and the full 200. We're just always going to take the 50 and the 20. And so that should give us a bit more, scaling will be a bit more consistent across crit and vulnerable, and you're not going to be incentivized to every build has to stack critical strike damage and has to stack vulnerable. It'll still be valuable to do it for builds that are interested in that, but it's not going to be the best in slot for every single build every time.
I want to say one of the things we wanted to do here was still motivate you, and you should be glad to be mixing multiplicative buckets. It's still an interesting thing to do. Just your opportunity cost isn't insane if you don't. So now you can do other things.
Yeah, so the overall impact that players are going to feel in Season of Blood with this is that the nominal damage numbers that you're doing are going to go down slightly. And that's because you just don't have this massive multiplicative bonuses. But we're not here trying to make the player weaker against monsters. What we actually did was we went through and looked at all the monsters in the game and retuned them to make sure that players who are optimizing their build and have strong builds are still approximately as equal against monsters as they were before. Mixing damage types, as we said, was going to be less required. It's still powerful to do, but it's not going to be the end-all be-all of the only way you can build your character. And of course, building individual damage types are going to be more equal in value, mainly, like I said, about overpower. Overpower builds are just falling behind. Same with things like dot damage builds or minion-focused builds. Those are going to come up and be much more comparable to builds like critical strike-focused ones or vulnerable-focused ones, and so on.
Yeah, so we have a little visual here, but imagine this is like the current season where crit and vuln builds are just really high up there. They're doing a ton of damage. They're wiping everything. And then all the other builds are kind of pretty far behind, right? If you're not mixing these two things, then you're just less effective. In Season 2, what we're doing is we're bringing them together, and then what we're going to do after that is balance monster power around this. So, again, our goal is not to make you weaker. It's to make everything have more parity, and we're going to balance the whole game around this new world that we live in the Season of Blood.
Yeah, it's not about bringing crit and vuln down. It's about making sure other builds can reach that same level of power that crit and vuln builds experienced in Season of the Malignant. It'll just open up the space for more builds to reach that type of power level with a variety of skills and affixes and not just crit and vuln. So let's talk a little bit about the overall goals for the damage bucket changes. First and foremost, we really want players to be rewarded for investing into their primary vector of damage. So for example, if you're a blood necromancer who really likes to overpower enemies, you're going to be rewarded for investing in plus overpower damage, as well as other tanky stats that scale it, like health and fortify generation. And then once you invest in that as like the main bulk of your power, you can find other ways of increasing that. Maybe you do find a way to apply vulnerable, but it's not going to be the main focus of your build. You can also get a lot of skill ranks to increase whatever your core skill rank is. Those still increase your core skill damage multiplicatively with skill ranks, which goes back to what Adam had said earlier about how powerful skill ranks are going to be going forward into Season of Blood. Also, we don't want this to just make the game simpler. We know that right now players they feel like they're getting crit and vulnerable on their gear, and that's great. That adds an interesting layer of the item chase, like, hey, you found the best in slot item. And with this change, it's not going to be that exact same, but our intention is not to make the itemization game simpler or more boring, because we're actually making a bunch of other changes to make this a bonus, to find other ways of scaling your character in interesting ways that Adam is going to talk about here.
Yeah. So last but not least, we're going to talk about making it a bonus, and I'm going to kind of expose a gap in our armor here. What we were really afraid of when we were looking at doing these changes is that in a vacuum, if we did this and nothing else, we think that it could be a negative experience to the game, kind of what Charles alluded to. What I am terrified of is that we do these changes and the reaction basically is, wait, you're lowering my damage and you're making it less rewarding to try and build crit and vuln. This is awful. I hate it, right? This isn't our goal, and we knew that we had to combine this with some other systemic updates to the game to make sure that this new world of itemization, damage buckets, and builds was something that's interesting and kind of has some meat to it as a player. And also what we mentioned before is that we are, again, going to be tuning monsters to be more appropriate with the new player power level. Our goal here is that your player power difference should be minimal. If anything, you'll probably feel more powerful compared to before just because of all the unique upgrades and other class updates and changes that we're making to the game. So you shouldn't really have a huge difference in how you feel going through mobs and dungeons and things. Just you're having more options of how you do it. So here's the other big part of our updates. We're adding effects to kind of give that scaling back, but instead of having it be baseline, we're going to do it through player interaction. So if you remember before that little graphic of the crit and vuln was really high and the other player power was down below, how are we bringing these things together? Well, we're going to bring that player power up for the other builds through these kind of designs and effects. So the goals with these changes before we get into them are twofold. The first is we want to add some multiplicative power back to the player, but in a more interesting way. Because as we mentioned before, we are removing multiplicative power by capping it with crit and vuln. So we want it now, like the upside of that is that we can actually give it back, but we can do it now in choices that you make as a player rather than it just being an underhood thing about how the game works. And then we also want to try and make the itemization experience better, particularly in the latter portions of the game. We want the stats you chase on your items to kind of be more tailored to your build and be a little bit more interesting. This isn't the end-all be-all of our plans for itemization, but this is just one way that we think we can try and make your stats and your gear and how they mix with your build a little bit more interesting. So now let's go through an example. So this is these kinds of effects are what we added kind of all over the place on all the classes of ways to give you multiplicative power. So on the left here is the old elemental summoner Paragon node legendary, Paragon legendary node on the sorcerer. And before it basically said, we want you to put all the conjuration skills on your bar. And when you do, they have reduced cooldown and mana cost per skill you have. This is your Hydra, your Ice Blades, and your Lightning Spear, right? We have one for each element. Now you're still going to get that. You can see on the right, this is the Season of Blood's design. So they still get reduced cooldown and mana cost, but now we've given you a goal to chase and a way to multiplicatively scale their damage. So the way it works here is that those conjuration skills are all going to deal multiplicative more damage based on the total amount of your bonus damage stat with fire, lightning, and cold. So here you can see, and I think these numbers actually match to what the current bonus is. So what we want you to do here is you go to your character sheet and you're like, okay, I want to get bonus damage to fire, lightning, and cold. These, are like your plus fire damage on your gear or whatever, right? Normally these stats aren't very attractive, but now they're going to be a lot more attractive because they will multiplicatively, these additive stats will now turn into multiplicative stats if you take this node and you go for this specific build. And the other really neat thing about this is that it makes your Paragon board or Paragon nodes, and even we can make items or other effects more interesting where we say, hey, you get bonus non-physical damage. That will actually triple dip with this Paragon node legendary power because it will increase your damage with fire, lightning, and cold, and so it actually will triple the amount that this one node would give you in value for this one legendary power. And we've added these effects kind of all over the place. You're going to see a lot more scaling. You're going to care about different stats that you didn't care about before because now they can be multiplicative depending on what you get. Here's another one. This is one for the Rogue. This is a redesign that we're doing for no witnesses. So what this does is this one makes you care about your damage with ultimate stat. So this was a stat that could appear on your gear. It usually wasn't very good. No one really tried to chase it. But this says that now your ultimate skills on your Rogue will deal multiplicative more damage based on that stat. And when you cast your ultimate, that multiplicative damage will apply to all of your skills for 8 seconds. So this kind of enables a complete new build with the Rogue where you want to spam, Rain of Arrows or whatever ultimate you can as often as you can, because even just using the ultimate is going to give you a multiplicative bonus, and that bonus on all of your skills will be based on this damage with ultimate stat that you can get via gear and Paragon and other places.
Yeah, I think Rogue is my favorite class to play that new flicker step unique on, where
yes,
when you're evading through enemies,
here.
you get a lot of ultimate cooldown reduction. It lets you trigger no witnesses more often. You want to build a lot of ultimate, and you can play it, with Rain of Arrows or Shadow Clone or Death Trap. Any of them, it just feels really good and a much more cohesive package that lets you scale to a really strong late game build and is not just based around crit and vuln. It's now based around ultimate skill damage.
Yeah, and to be clear here, this will be on all the classes got some amount of this, and it's not only on the Paragon board. Some of it, your key passives will be doing it. Some uniques will be doing this. There's kind of a bunch of places. And I believe last but not least, so if you remember last time we were on stream and I talked, I brought up how we had a stated goal of trying to scale effects that don't really scale very well. These are generally effects where there's a legendary power that spawns a thing, like let's say earthquakes with the barbarian or dust devils on the barbarian, things like that. And those effects didn't really scale very well, and we wanted to add things that do. So in the Season of Blood, we've added some things. This isn't going to be everything we do forever. This is just the beginning, but we've got 2 new Paragon glyphs per class where we are going to be adding these scaling effects. So now you can create builds, hopefully, that you weren't really able to before, and we gave you a way to scale them. And again, we're planning to do more of this kind of design in the future. I think it's very interesting. And yeah, so here's going to be some examples. So the first one is Rumble. This is a new Barbarian glyph, and it's basically going to let your earthquakes scale multiplicatively with all the strength that you get in an area around the glyph when you slot it. And then you also deal more damage based on each active earthquake that you have. So you want to get a lot of active earthquakes, and it makes you more powerful.
Just to clarify, I think when you building strength around this will give additive damage to your earthquakes. Most glyphs on the top section is all additive damage.
Oh yeah, good clarification.
But then the second half, the additional bonus gives you a multiplicative bonus based on how many earthquakes you're creating. So it's still great for earthquake builds because it increases all of your damage that way.
Yeah. Next is the Stalagmite. This is for the Sorcerer. So we're giving you a way to scale your ice spikes per intelligence purchase within range, and then also your ice spikes are going to have a higher crit chance. And then we've got Explosive. This one is for the Rogue, and this one lets you scale your stun grenade damage with Dexterity. And then also you're going to get damage reduction whenever you drop a stun grenade.
All right. I know we've gone through a ton of slides here.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of slides, a lot of stuff to actually cover regarding class changes, of course, all the damage bucket changes and everything. One thing to note is I know we only highlighted a few specific things on classes. As we've mentioned, patch notes are actually going to be coming after the stream. So you'll be able to read through every single class change, all the different changes that we've even talked about last week on the stream, and other items, including bug fixes and everything.
Yeah, there's a lot of this.
It's a pretty lengthy patch notes. It's by far our largest one yet, for sure. Yeah. In fact, I think if you add up all our patch notes beforehand, this one ends up being half of all our prior patch notes combined. So
wow.
It's pretty significant.
It was a lot for us to do. Yeah.
Yes. So patch notes will end up going live here after the stream, so you can check it out on Diablo4.com. We do want to talk about some of our future changes that are also going to be coming post Season 2. For instance, patch 121. We haven't even hit patch 120. Patch 120 is coming out on October 17th with the start of Season 2. But patch 121 is actually going to be coming out after Season 2, but before BlizzCon. But we did want to actually cover what would be in patch 121. And we also wanted to talk about how future content pieces, within Season 2, we're going to be constantly updating and adding new features to the game within Season 2. And players will hear more about that at BlizzCon and future streams. But one big thing that we are adding in 121 is a training dummy, kind of a target dummy where you can actually practice builds, test out different items and everything like that. This will be located in Kiovushad in a cellar, and you can actually customize it and change it from a normal training dummy to adding additional ones or boss ones, and you'll actually be able to test out different builds. So this will be coming in 121. Just a reminder, I'm going to continuously say that so people don't go why wasn't it in on October 17th? 121.
Yes.
But this will be towards the end of this month. We'll have more information as that actually hits. And then the other feature that we're going to be adding, and this one's a big one that I know people have been asking for. In 121, there will be an option for you to be able to reset your Paragon board, which we know that everyone has been asking for, and it's something that we've been wanting to put in. And so
easier respecs.
Yeah, easier respecs is going to be way better for players. And so in 121, that feature will actually be coming. And again, like I said, towards the end of this month, we'll have that. We'll talk more about that. There will be patch notes associated with that update. And of course, we'll have more updates to Season 2 that we'll be talking about at BlizzCon. So you should make sure to check out BlizzCon if you're going, or if you want to go, you can still grab a ticket. And of course, we also yesterday announced the BlizzCon collection, which has a bunch of Diablo 4 stuff along with some World of Warcraft, Hearthstone, Overwatch items in there. But with the Diablo 4 items, it does include like the Legendary Collection actually includes a token for the Premium Battle Pass. The Premium Battle Pass, we've been getting a lot of questions about this. The Premium Battle Pass token in that can be used for Season 2 if you want, or it can be used for any future season. So you can use that token, you can save it if you like, and that is included in this. And it also has some really cool mounts with some cool effects and mount armor and everything. So. But that is available on the Battle.net shop now and that is the BlizzCon collection.
Cool.
We have some Q&A that we do want to go over today. I know that players, if you have questions, feel free to jump into Twitch chat and ask your questions. I will butcher your names. Guaranteed. It's a promise I do every stream. That's why they bring me here. But we'll be answering questions on Twitch chat. But the first question I know that we've heard a lot about is what are your plans for like underperforming skills? Because it's been something that we've heard a little bit about it today, but I think it's something that we've been hearing for the last couple months of like, hey, some of these builds just don't feel viable. It feels like I'm going under one build. Like, what are you guys planning on doing that?
Totally. Well, first we plan to redo all the underlying math of the game and change how all the builds work and change all the so skills specifically. Yeah, there are definitely skills that are underperforming that don't have as wide of a use case as we would want. I would say we're going to try and look at them at an individual basis on a skill by skill. There are definitely ones that we've identified as a team that we're already going to start taking a look at. We learn a lot when we launch the game to millions of people, right? Well, of course, we have ideas that sometimes pan out, sometimes they don't. And when they don't, we have to kind of reevaluate. Well, what was the purpose of it? Can we still keep the heart and the spirit of the skill without changing it completely? Or sometimes we do need to change it and make it like fit an actual use case that's unique that doesn't fit any other skill. So it kind of depends what our answer is on a skill by skill basis. But it is definitely a goal of ours that we don't want a skill to just languish forever and just not really have a use case or be useful. To clarify, though, I do think it's okay that a skill is a little more niche and maybe isn't, like, we're not saying every skill needs to be used equally by every player.
No.
I don't think that's a reasonable expectation. I don't know if it's very healthy, right? I think there's something attractive about feeling smart that you're able to find this niche use case or you're playing in a unique way that not many other people do. But if a skill isn't fulfilling even any purpose or the purpose it was intended for, then I think that's grounds to reevaluate and try and find something that works better for it.
Yeah, definitely. And there's a few different ways that a skill can kind of fall short, right? It's not just always a matter of numbers, right? It's not just, just crank up the damage on it. If the damage is crazy, of course it'll be usable. But that's not the right answer all the time. Sometimes, we talked about puncture earlier today on the Rogue. And if you look at just pure damage, puncture compared to the other basics on Rogue, about comparable. Like it wasn't an outlier in one way or another, but we saw so many players playing puncture because of its interaction with other systems, right? We had it, hey, puncture is a really easy way of applying vulnerable, and in Season of Malignant, vulnerable was really valuable. So we're not only tackling this on making the other options more usable and interact in an easier to use way, but also adjusting the systemic issue like, hey, vulnerable's too mandatory, so you have to take the thing that applies vulnerable. And now that that's less of a hard requirement, we're hoping that brings these other basics to the fore. And we're going to take a similar approach when we look at other underperforming skills as well.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point, is that, we talked a lot about base systems of the game in the Season of Blood. And a reason why we're really looking at all these base systems and changing them pretty significantly is that we want a stronger foundation so that we can identify these outlying skills or effects. And now we can fix them in a way that's more healthy for the overall game. Because when the overall systems are healthy, then we can go back and look at the outliers and fix them in a good way. Like we could have fixed puncture by just taking away the vulnerable application, right? But really the problem is vulnerable, not puncture necessarily.
Yeah.
So.
All right, we have a question here from Zigzag. Are channeling skills still not allowed to overpower after this patch, considering the scaling changes?
This is true, yes. It's just part of the way Diablo 4 works is that channeling skills do not overpower. That's partially because it would just if you overpower is determined on a skill cast basis. So when you cast a skill, the game determines, hey, did you overpower or did you not? And if you overpower with a channel skill, then channel skills can in theory go on forever. And that would just be a situation we don't want to live in, where you're just fishing for procs basically of overpower, and then as soon as you get it, you let it go forever. That's not really the kind of gameplay we want to encourage in Diablo 4. And so it's true that yes, channeled skills do not overpower. But we're still looking, when we're looking to balance channeled skills, such as Incinerate, we know that going in.
Yeah, they should be balanced and tuned around the fact that they can't overpower. And actually, to allude to that, because that's a good segue, if you remember back, I talked about the Barbarian and the Druid, how we're capping that unlimited cap of power that you can get. That's kind of also why overpower doesn't work on channeled skills, is that if we made it work, we would have to tune and balance all of overpower around the potential infinite duration that a channeled skill has. Yeah. And that means that now overpower only gets used for channeled skills, because that's the only place that it's going to be good, and then everything else doesn't feel as good because of it. That's why we're adding these caps and things to some places, is that it's not really because we don't like people to get a lot of power, it's that everything else must become weak for one thing to be even reasonable, let alone strong, if we allow infinite scaling of things. And that makes, while that one thing might be really cool, it makes the overall game much less fun or interesting.
I'm going to spitfire a few questions. I'm just going to answer really quickly, just so I can a lot of questions here.
Yeah, totally.
Are there plans on yearly roadmaps and roadmaps for the game? BlizzCon. Stay tuned. In regards to, we're getting a lot of questions about social features and group finders and clan features and everything. Those are things that we're looking at and most definitely have been taking in a lot of feedback. Nothing to announce today, but it is something that I know the team is very much reading and seeing. Does this mean that Tempest Roar only drops from Duriel, or can it drop from other rare mobs? No, it can drop from other rare mobs. Duriel just happens to have we were showcasing the specific drop tables for uniques for these bosses here. So you'll know, hey, if I want to get a Tempest Roar on a Druid or something, I can actually farm Duriel and have a better chance of knowing that.
I wanted to clarify, you can still get them in the other parts of the game. When you finish Nightmare Dungeon or go through it, they can still drop off of mobs, be it end of Nightmare Dungeon reward, you still get them out of Hell Tide, all those things. Just doing this, you have a higher chance to get these specific things.
Yep. Let's see, we have a question from Sock and Boppers. Will we be seeing more support or basic focus builds this time around? I don't know
basic skills?
I guess so.
Yeah, basic builds. Basic skill builds. Yeah.
Yeah, there's not as much support for building your entire build around dealing damage with basic skills. That's not something that we have a ton of support in the game for right now or in Season of Blood, but it's definitely something on our radar, is hey, this is a cool idea of making your basic skill, kind of flipping it on its head, right? Basic skills right now are a bit more of a setup, a bit more of a generator type of skill. That's definitely a design space that we are looking into and will be making designs for in the future. Don't have any specifics to share yet, obviously, but it's certainly on our radar to enable those going forward.
Yeah, we know it and we think it's cool too.
Yep.
Here's some more designer-specific questions from Lucky Luciano. I know that person. How are the Necromancer and Sorceress classes being balanced to account for the changes to resistances which intelligence characters inherently benefit from?
Sure. I could take this one. So one thing to keep in mind is when you're making a fantasy ARPG or a fantasy-based games, we do actively want there to be some differences between the classes, where some are better or worse at some things than others, right? We want them to have boons for picking your class so that they're, you feel different than all the other ones, right? If everyone was just like a blank class, that would be a very different game than what we made for Diablo. So that was partially why when we talked about resistances, we talked a lot about how our goals are that everyone can kind of comfortably get there. Because what we didn't want was, if resistances really matter and you can't get to cap, or you can only get to cap at level 100 with maxed out gear, and even then you may not be able to, and you have to do this really complicated puzzle, then those classes would have a really large advantage over the other ones in the elemental resistance realm, right? And a lot of our bosses and things do that type of damage, so it would actually be a really big balancing issue. Because of that, we made it that it's a very achievable goal. This goal might be a little bit easier to get on sorcerers, necromancers, or whoever, they have the int scaling with elemental resistances or whatever stat may have you. And we also even purposely make effects like passive nodes or paragon nodes or other designs that are class specific. Different classes can get to different breakpoints easier than other ones, and that's by design. Kind of if you remember what I talked about, like the perfect balance world, and we have like a gap. This is the world we actually live in. We want like barbarians to be better at some things than necros, or druids to be better at some things than rogues, and vice versa, right? That makes for a more interesting and compelling experience where your class experience when you're playing through the game feels different, right? Like if you play a sorcerer for the first time and when you've played a barbarian your whole life, you're like, oh wow, it's really nice that it's easier for me to fix this resistance game than when I'm playing on my barb. Or hey, when I'm playing on a barb compared to a sword, it's really nice. I have all these unstoppable skills that move me around everywhere. Like we want there to be kind of differences in pros and cons to things. So really when we need to make a change is when it gets out of that realm that's kind of reasonable, right? If something's too far down even where, it's too painful to play a class for some reason, right? Like we've heard some feedback from Necromancer players where we don't give them a ton of mobility and they're, kind of sad, hey, we don't have enough and we need to get brought up here. Well, we're okay with being a little lower. We just, what we're at is not acceptable. And then same thing on the high end, right? Where maybe it's too easy to get things, then we need to bring it in. So, yeah, the answer is we made resistances this way, knowing this in mind, so that, barbarians, it's still going to be very easy for you to get to this cap just by playing the game and doing a little bit of planning. So we don't expect there to be a huge power discrepancy, especially since everyone's going to get to that cap eventually anyways.
Awesome. We have a question from Psychophant, which is a good question. It's for barbarians specifically.
Sure.
What are your plans to address barbarian resource generation and uncoupling it from shouts?
Yeah, in the season of blood, we haven't completely answered the shout issue, which we're aware of. Like, players want to put on all the shouts and then shout all the time and just yell at enemies a lot, I guess.
They shout at me a lot.
We're still looking at what we want our solutions to be. And we're also looking at a similar thing with sorcerers with equipping defensive skills, where they want to take like Frost Nova and Flame Shield and Teleport and do all of them. It's a deeper issue to solve that I think requires us to really look at why people are picking them and just make sure that they're still okay picking some, just not picking all of them all the time. We don't have anything to announce yet, but it is something that we are aware of. But it's a little bit more complicated, I think. One of the things, I'll just be transparent about how, at least for shouts, we're thinking is one of the issues that made it hard was that we designed a lot of our passives and our legendary effects and other things that said, when you shout, gain X. And so right away, that becomes triple more powerful when you put on 3 shouts instead of 1. Mm-hmm. And we didn't balance it that way where, we expected everyone to just always take the 3 things. Same with defensive skills or anything else that's synergistic like that. On the one hand, we like these kinds of designs like, hey, your core skills do more damage or your other things, of a category do more to make you think about mixing the category. But when we go too far, and we definitely, I think, did with shouts as an example, then it just says, hey, do all of them or don't do any of them. And the answer right now is really do all of them because they're all really strong independently. So we may need to decouple them, which is like, hey, instead of all your shouts get increased duration or you always heal when your shouts are active, it'll be when specific shouts are. But then, that doesn't feel good. It's kind of limiting because we're kind of telling you what to do. So we have to try and walk that balance really well, which is a difficult tightrope to walk.
A question here regarding glyphs from Max78. Sorry, I don't want to butcher the name. Any plans on making more glyphs or bonuses spell agnostic?
Yes. So as we're making more content going forward in future seasons, we're going to be making a lot more glyphs. And that is definitely design space, is to work on categories of skills or either other unique effects. It's not always going to be, and honestly, we showcased 3 glyphs here on the stream, and we're adding in 10 new glyphs in Season of Blood. And they're not all that exact same design.
Yeah.
So yes, the design space for making new glyphs is definitely very open, and it's something we're going to be exploring going forward.
Awesome. This is actually a good question because we talked about CC last week, which is this is from Masticaz. So what's the reduction for CC? I know you said against the player. But with an overall reduction, does that reduce the sorcerer's ability to CC enemies specifically, and then the amount applied to enemies? And
no, we didn't do any changes or significant changes to outgoing CC. This is only incoming CC to the player, not CC of you to the monster.
That's actually a really good question, because I know when you hear like, oh, reduction of CC, it's like, oh, now I'm going to CC enemies way less.
That's a good point. No,
just on the player itself, because we have heard a lot of feedback from players about, sometimes you just get, especially in higher level dungeons, you just get completely stuck. And all the CC changes are actually noted in the patch notes, so you'll be able to read more about that. Question from Darth Microtransaction, DM. Know who DM is? He's a Diablo partner that we have. How many total new legendaries and new unique items are coming in Season 2? Any new Uber uniques? Yes, there are all 3 of those that are being added. And
new legendaries, new uniques, not new Uber.
Not Uber uniques.
Uber.
Yes, sorry. That is all in the patch notes. So you'll read them in the patch notes.
Yeah, you'll get to see them very soon. I don't have the exact number off my head.
I think
know
it's
a pretty
18
good amount.
total, I believe.
18?
Yeah, there's 5 class legendaries, 5 class uniques, and then 2 generic legendaries and 6.
Instead of us just randomly
I don't want to give you a raw number. You'll see it really soon. There's a good number.
Check the patch notes. Yes.
All right, we're going to take one more question here. This is from Cropier. With the changes to damage buckets, it'll be much harder to just stack very high damage to overcome some of the hardest content like Uber Lilith. Do you plan to make adjustments to bosses to account for lower damage ceilings?
Oh, how far do I want to go into this answer? We've had a lot of conversations about this. All right. So, yes, we did look at monster power and boss power, and specifically Uber Lilith as well. So why don't we talk about Uber Lilith tuning, because we did actually tune her a little bit specially in the Season of Blood and going forward. So our idea with tuning Uber Lilith and this aspirational, very difficult content, right? Kind of a little history lesson, right? When the game came out, Uber Lilith obviously was very, very hard. Right, like I say, her power level's up here, right? Everything else, like comparably, is somewhere around here. She's ridiculously crazy hard. Really, the only builds that were able to beat her were builds that had either like really, really strong interactions, like Bone Spear Necro, where it was just like really, really overtuned, or ones that were bugged, right? Where they just got like 100x more power than other things, and it wasn't really intended. We don't really want our aspirational content to live in that space where like only oversights can really beat it comfortably. Our goal for it was always that most builds would be able to beat it, and it was kind of an achievable goal, but it was hard. And obviously having that balance in a multiplicative scaling game is really hard, it turns out. In Season of Blood, one thing that is really nice and is an advantage to all of these overhauls that we're doing to our math and the power level of the classes is that before, like we talked about, the difference of multiplicative power of the Crit Vol and everyone else was Crit Vol was way up here and could compete with her. Everything else couldn't really. So you kind of were forced into these builds to have a fair chance at the fight, which isn't really the world that we want to live in. Now that we've kind of, stabilized the ground of all the builds, they can't, in theory, I'm hoping, can't get as crazy of a difference in power level between each other. That means that now we can more finely tune things like Uber Lilith, like any other endgame content that we make, that they can be more stable as far as who can beat them. So we took a look at Uber Lilith, and you'll see that we've tested her internally with builds that aren't those ones that we know are crazy, and tuned her to a degree where we believe these average builds will be able to defeat her. Obviously, there will be variance. Like I said, the top ones and the bottom ones there will be some, but it'll be much more in line with one another. So we did take a look at that specifically, and we do believe that just the foundation of the game as a whole will mean that more players and more builds will be able to do more content.
Yeah, it goes back to what I was saying in the damage bucket discussion, was that our intention is not to just bring everyone down. It's to open up the room for more builds to reach that same level of power. Let more builds take on Uber Lilith and not just have to rely on either crit vulnerable interaction or rely on bugged interactions. You don't have to.
At the end of the day, what this will likely mean also is that if you are a crazy strong build, or if you find something that's crazy strong, she'll probably be easier compared to live. But then your average person, she'll be much more doable.
You still have to play really well, though. It's a hard fight still.
She's still hard.
It's still a hard fight.
Yeah, and I think there's also even just changes that you guys had already talked about regarding like resistances and things like that. That will also be
like the
beneficial
foundation
for
of
them.
everything
the
is
fight
different,
gonna
but
be- yeah, most
I think
definitely.
overall it'll be more achievable.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Adam. Thank you, Charles, for joining us, and everyone for listening to a bunch of designers
A whole lot of math.
go
and design
into numbers
problems.
and math and everything for you guys regarding class changes and all the other damage buckets and resistance changes that are coming to the game. Just a reminder, Season 2, Season of Blood, starts on October 17th. That is the same day Season 1, Season of the Malignant, ends. So you guys will find that the transition between seasons will just be fluid from one season to the next. But that will begin on October 17th. Also, of course, like what we announced last week, Diablo 4 is coming to Steam. So you can wishlist that now. So if you prefer to play on Steam, you have that option of being able to grab Diablo 4 on Steam. And so you can go there and wishlist Diablo 4 there right now. And it will be available on October 17th. That does support cross-progression and cross-platform play. So if you do want to play with other people on Battle.net or on consoles, you still can. And if you want to carry over your progress from Battle.net or consoles over to Steam, you still can as well from there. But October 17th, Season 2, Season of Blood, and at the same time, 121, just a reminder, the target dummy that we talked about and the Reset Paragon board feature will be coming in 121. That will be landing in late October and before BlizzCon. So make sure to tune in for those notes. Do I have anything else I need to say? Oh, BlizzCon. Make sure check us out at BlizzCon.
BlizzCon, really excited.
Yeah, BlizzCon's gonna be really cool. So thank you guys again. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Adam. And we'll see you guys in game.
Thank you so much. See you in game.